Let's go now to the main argument Dawkins is making to defend evolution theory, which is his actual blind watchmaker's arguments. The watchmaker argument is basically evolution theory's insurmountable problem of irreducible complexity. The reality that within and between living organisms there exists a myriad of complex, highly integrated and highly interdependent systems where multiple components must be existent and fully operational before the unit can work. Loss or absence of any single component renders the whole unit or system useless and inoperable. A watch was selected as an easily understood example of the concept of irreducible complexity. The sole purpose of a watch is to keep track of time by the smooth operation of a complex system of cogs, springs, hands, frames, dials, etc. Take away any single component and the whole system ceases to do its function or give any benefit. You cannot evolve a watch one bit at a time over millions of years. It's just a piece of useless, lifeless metal until the very last component is in place. Only then does it all work together to do what it is designed to do and achieve what it is designed to achieve. Living organisms are full of such irreducibly complex systems that simply cannot be evolved bit by bit over millions of years as evolution theory demands. What evolution theory demands is the impossible. What Dawkins tries to do in endeavouring to provide a very simplistic, if not very naive explanation, is to simply try and sidestep and ignore the reality of the complexities the theory of evolution has no answer for. One of his explanations shows him trying to break into a safe. The overtone of a dishonest act is kind of ironic in the circumstances. But his claim is that where evolution is concerned, there is no need to get the combination right and open a safe in one go. But that is simply sidestepping the reality of irreducible complexity. The whole point of irreducible complexity is you must get the combination exactly right before there is any evolutionary advancement that opens the way to a natural selection advantage. Turning the dials is random genetic mutation, but the door itself represents the next step through which an organism must pass in order to gain advantage in the fierce competition of natural selection. Until the combination is exactly right and the door to an advantageous feature opened, there is no reward, no matter how many times you spin the dials. The irony is that Dawkins declared the very point of irreducible complexity when he said, "I get absolutely no reward for getting some of the problem right." But, sadly, in his single-minded narrow focus to defend evolution theory, he totally missed the significance and truth of his own words. Another supposed example of evolution in action involves a little meaningless and pointless program Dawkins wrote that enables random generation of images on a screen by random changes to an initial image, and then the ability to select an offspring image to become the parent image of the next generation. According to Dawkins, this is a simple example of how evolution by random mutation combined with natural selection works. But again, it is not a simple explanation, but a highly simplistic explanation that just sidesteps and ignores reality in an attempt to evade the many insurmountable problems evolution by genetic mutation has with reality. It's kind of ironic that in trying to disprove the need for God, Dawkins should choose an example in which he himself plays God, by deciding what shall and shall not live in a computer-generated universe of which he himself is the creator. But in all seriousness, the model suffers severe and fatal flaws if it is meant to reflect reality in any way. Firstly, the programmed universe and DNA structure of his sprites are by intelligent design. Dawkins did not leave the computer to come up with the program all by itself. Even the so-called random mutations are by the design of the programmer god Dawkins. But then the programmed random mutations do not actually have to do anything. They do not have to be living, self-sustaining, self-reproducing organisms adapted for survival and sustained integration in and interdependence on a given or changing environment. They do not have to be capable of survival in the real world, nor do they have to have any actual competitive advantage over the parent or the other offspring. All that happens is a godlike finger descends from above onto the keyboard and declares, "That one." This pointless exercise is merely an example of how the imagination of Dawkins works, not how actual reality works. Now, most of the rest of the video is simply atheistic rhetoric and theist mockery, which at times is pretty synonymous. So I will concentrate the last bit of this video on Dawkins' extremely simplistic explanation of how something as complex as an eye can evolve bit by bit. After all, theism has no argument with industry using an intelligently designed algorithm and process to eventually overcome a problem in achieving an intelligently derived purpose. This, after all, is intelligent design in action. So let's take a closer look at Dawkins' so-called demonstration of how an eye can evolve slowly, bit by bit. By a series of simplistic diagrams, Dawkins announces that he is going to show us from scratch how an eye can evolve. Except that he doesn't show us from scratch. He simply leaves a whole lot of very important reality out of his diagrams altogether. Let me use the same diagrams to show you what I mean. The first diagram we're shown depicts a few cells that happen to have pigment that is sensitive to light. Absolutely no explanation at all of how these cells or the mechanism that allows them to be sensitive to light of certain important wavelengths came to exist. Just that there are cells that have pigmentation that happens to be sensitive to light. So the demonstration is not from scratch at all. Then he fails to mention that light-sensitive pigment by itself has no visual advantage to the organism. Hence, from a visual aspect, no natural selection advantage at all comes from light-sensitive pigment alone. To have any visual advantage, the cell must also contain a complex system that converts that specific sensitivity to a coded signal. But that, in itself, also has no advantage to the organism. In addition, there needs to be highly specialized cells capable of receiving this highly specialized coded signal and transmitting it. But wait, there needs to be still more. There also needs to be a cell with a complex mechanism capable of receiving this transmitted and coded signal and then decode and interpret it. It also then needs another specialized system to transform its interpretation into various different signals and transmit them to various parts of the organism via another complex network of specialized conductive nerve cells to initialize an integrated response to the original signal. Of course, the target cells themselves need highly complex systems capable of receiving those signals and converting them to appropriate actions and responses. Only then does the organism receive any visual benefit at all from the light-sensitive pigment. But it gets worse. After simply ignoring the necessity of these complex and highly integrated and interdependent systems and structures, Dawkins shows the cells magically lining a concave structure, but no indication of how the concave structure they line might evolve. After all, the light-sensitive cells themselves are not forming the structure. They are simply lining it. But still not a sign of the complex nerve and brain cell system behind the eye, necessary before the cells serve any useful purpose or give any benefit to the organism. But now there is another complex system Dawkins is totally ignoring. There now needs to be an integrated system capable of taking all the signals from the cells and by the pattern they form, interpret the location and direction of the incoming light and transmit different signals to the other cells dependent on that direction and location to coordinate an even more complex response. Without this complex interpretation and response system that Dawkins blithely ignores, a concave eye structure is of no benefit whatsoever. But just when you think Dawkins could not do worse, he makes a suggestion that any biologist worth his degree should know is quite silly. He proposes that a blob of mucus gets stuck in the eye hole and becomes a rudimentary lens. Now, mucus is something living cells secrete. It's composed of either dead tissue or dying cells. It does not contain the life-sustaining structures necessary to maintain the complex living lens structure of real eyes. If the organism lives underwater, the mucus will either dissolve or be eaten by bacteria or other scavengers. As it decays under bacterial attack, it will either become opaque or fall out. If it is a land-dwelling organism, it is likely to dry out and fall out before it fully decays or becomes opaque as bacteria attack it. The cells in the eye hole would have to continuously produce mucus, but not just any mucus. It has to be totally transparent, crystal clear mucus, if it is to have any visual benefit. But then it would fill the eye hole and continually ooze out of the hole itself. But without any mechanism to keep the outside edge of the mucus clean, clear, mirror smooth, and free of bacterial or scavenger attack or physical damage, it will soon lose any visual benefit it might have imparted. It would actually render the organism more blind than those who did not secrete mucus. There is a whole lot of other necessities that Dawkins is either unaware of or simply forgot to mention in his over-enthusiastic endeavours to defend evolution instead of putting it under the rigours of proper scientific scrutiny. For instance, what mechanism takes a layer of secreted mucus and carefully reforms and remolds it to the optically clear ovoid free of imperfections necessary for correct focusing? What feedback mechanism tells the eye cells whether or not the mucus has actually lodged in the eye hole, so they know whether or not to stop secreting, or whether to try again? If it does not lodge, nothing is gained. And if it lodges, the cells have to stop secreting, otherwise nothing is gained. A clear optical quality ovoid of mucus will act just like a magnifying glass. So what mechanism prevents the eye cells from being burnt to a crisp any time the sun or reflected sun is in the field of vision? If any single one of the additional mechanisms I have already mentioned so far is missing, the whole eye assembly is rendered visually useless and of no evolutionary benefit to the organism at all. The organism remains effectively blind. Dawkins leaves it there, probably because the simplistic nature of his proposal would become way too obvious were he to proceed. Because then he would have to try and explain how the cavity can transition to a lubricated enclosed eye structure swivelling inside the cavity, with a complex, highly integrated muscle system controlling both movement of the eyeball and the complex, highly integrated focusing mechanism of the lens and the iris units working together to focus the image on the retina, upside down, where the complex nerve and brain system reinterpreted right side up. He would also have to explain how, at the same instance the eyeball is evolved, along with the complex muscle system, without which it is less than useless, the optic nerve cells he forgot to mention previously must also suddenly reformat themselves to become a single nerve structure with a flexible link to the eyeball, allowing it to rotate in all directions without damaging, kinking, stretching, or snapping the optic nerves. Then he would also have had to explain how the previously fixed place visual system suddenly evolved to introduce feedback from the eye muscle system, necessary to reinterpret the optic nerve signals based on the eyeball's relative position compared to the rest of the body. A vital, complex and highly integrated system if the brain is to have any chance of properly interpreting a visual signal from an eyeball that could be pointing in any direction at any time relative to the body. And that is without even beginning to contemplate the complex systems required for two eyeballs to work in unison. Although only a brief overview, hopefully viewers will now have a better understanding of the impenetrable barrier, irreducible complexity that is the watchmaker argument, puts in the path of the theory of evolution. Evolution theory is contrary to the evidence of reality on many points, but none more so than its complete inability to explain complex, highly integrated structures and systems that simply have no way of evolving bit by bit, because as Dawkins himself said when trying to open the safe door, which in reality represents the correct combination of all the elements necessary before a feature is able to provide any benefit to the organism. He said, I get absolutely no reward for getting some of the problem right. If only he could stop and see, in his own words, the reality that makes bit-by-bit evolution by random mutation and natural selection an impossibility. But just before I finish, I cannot let Dawkins get away with a silly argument I would have thought even he would have been smart enough to not risk his reputation making. Dawkins holds up Roger Green and Linda Drummond Walker as examples of how somebody with 5% of an eye can still function. It's a silly argument to make, of course, because both Roger and Linda have 100% of their eyes. What has actually happened in reality is that only 5% of a single component of those complex eyes, namely the retina, is working properly. They do not have only 5% of their eyes. They have only 5% of their field of vision. Within that field of vision, their eyes are operating at 100%. But, in putting forward this silly argument, Dawkins has given us the perfect example of irreducible complexity, the watchmaker problem evolution has no answer for. In this bit here for Roger, and this bit here for Linda, the complex systems and structures of their eyes are working as designed. But these blank areas here and here, where they are effectively blind, are because of the failure of one single component of that complex system, namely the retina. Everything else in these areas is still working properly, just as it is in the 5% field of vision they have. But the absence of a single component, the retina, renders the whole system in this area of no effect. Likewise, a person whose optic nerve has been severed still has a fully functioning eye, even though they are totally blind. Again, the loss of a single component, the optic nerve, renders the whole system of no effect. Again, in the very examples he uses, Dawkins is faced with the unavoidable reality of irreducible complexity, the watchmaker argument that is fatal to evolution theory. But even a fully functional eye is of no benefit if you do not pay attention to what it is telling you.